I was standing in a London pub that smelled like old wood and confidence, watching an American guy lean forward over his pint like he was about to close a business deal. He said, "I'm just saying, if you guys fixed your customer service, things would run way smoother." The British guy across from him didn't flinch. He took a sip, nodded politely, and said, "Yes, we do pride ourselves on being a constant disappointment." The American laughed, relieved. "See, exactly, you admit it." That's when I felt the air change. The Brit smiled gently, the way you smile at a child holding a crayon like it's a legal document. "Absolutely," he said. "We wake up every morning asking how we might slightly ruin someone's day." The American straightened. "I mean, that's not what I meant. I'm being constructive." "Of course you are," the Brit replied. "Nothing says helpful like feedback from a stranger who arrived yesterday." A couple people nearby coughed into their beers. The American didn't notice. He nodded earnestly. "Back home, we just say what we think." "How refreshing," the Brit said. "We prefer suspense." The American leaned in further, sensing debate. "No, seriously, why not just be direct?" The Brit paused, looked around the table, then back at him. "We are being direct," he said softly. "You're just not listening." The American frowned. "I don't think you're understanding me." "Oh, I understand you perfectly," the Brit said. "That's the problem." Laughter finally broke out, sharp and sudden. The American froze, confused, scanning faces for allies that weren't coming. And that's when I realized this wasn't an argument at all. It was a slow, polite dismantling, and he had volunteered for it. And everyone else at the table knew the outcome long before he did already there. After that night, I started noticing it everywhere. Different cities, different accents, same outcome. I'd hear an American say, "I don't get why you're being so weird about this." And a Brit would respond, "I'm not being weird at all. I'm being incredibly consistent." The American would nod. "Right, but you could just say that." The Brit would smile. "I just did." And the American would walk away thinking the conversation was unfinished, while the Brit walked away knowing it was over 3 sentences ago. This wasn't a one-off pub thing. I'd seen it in offices, at dinner tables, even in Airbnb kitchens at 1 a.m. once when an American guest said, "I just think it's inefficient to boil water in a kettle when microwaves exist." The British host blinked. "Yes," he said, "we're terribly attached to our medieval methods." "I mean, I'm serious," the American said. "So am I," the host replied, staring at the kettle like it had feelings. The American whispered to me later, "I think he was offended." He wasn't offended. He was done. The pattern was always the same. Americans entered conversations like debates, clear point, supporting logic, escalation if needed. Brits entered like spectators. They let you talk. They nodded. They gave you space. Then they handed you a sentence so light you didn't feel it land until everyone else laughed. And Americans hated that laugh because it felt unearned. "Why are they laughing?" one guy asked me after being absolutely flattened at a dinner party. I said, "Because the argument ended 10 minutes ago." The problem is Americans think sarcasm announces itself. Brits think announcing it is rude. So Americans kept swinging at shadows, saying things like, "No, I'm being genuine here," while Brits responded, "How brave of you." And the more Americans explained, the calmer Brits became, which felt illegal. You could see the confusion. You could hear it. "Are you agreeing with me or not?" an American asked once. The Brit thought about it. "I'm enjoying you," he said. That was the answer. And once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Because the arguments don't get louder. They get quieter, politer, sharper. And somehow, that makes what's coming next so much worse. The mild ones always start harmless, which is why Americans fall for them every time. I remember an American woman at a cafe saying, "I just like honesty. If something's bad, I say it." The British barista smiled and said, "How courageous of you," the woman beamed. "Thank you. People are too sensitive these days." "Yes," the barista replied, sliding over the coffee. "We've noticed." The woman walked away proud, convinced she'd been complimented. The rest of us stood there in silence because somehow she'd been gently insulted, warned, and dismissed in under 10 words. That was the aftermath. She thought she'd won. She didn't know a game had been played. Another time, an American guy in a shared office leaned back in his chair and said, "No offense, but this meeting could have been an email." The Brit across from him nodded thoughtfully. "Oh, absolutely," he said. "We mostly hold meetings so everyone can practice patience together." The American laughed. "Exactly. Waste of time." "Time is such a flexible concept," the Brit said, glancing at his watch. The American took that as agreement and doubled down. "In the States, we're just more efficient." "Yes," the Brit replied. "Efficiency is very loud where you're from." The meeting ended shortly after. Later, the American whispered, "I think he likes me." He didn't. He'd categorized him. My favorite mild case was at a dinner party when an American guest said, "You know, this food's actually pretty good." The British host paused mid-chew. "How generous of you," he said. "We try." The American nodded. "I mean, I didn't expect much." "Naturally," the host replied. The table went quiet. The American sensed tension. "I'm saying it's better than I thought." The host smiled. That's usually how surprises work. Aftermath was subtle but final. The American was never offered seconds. The reflection hit later when he asked me, "Did I say something wrong?" I told him, "You ranked the meal. Brits don't like being ranked." The thing with these mild cases is no one raises their voice. No one looks angry. That's why Americans keep pushing. They think, no reaction means no damage. But British sarcasm isn't about stopping you mid-sentence. It's about letting you finish and then deciding you're done. One American actually said, "Why are you being so polite about this?" The Brit answered, "I'm not being polite. I'm being clear." The American frowned, searching for the insult like it was a typo. That's when I realized the mild ones aren't warnings. They're training exercises, and if you miss them, the next round doesn't stay mild for long at all. The escalation always happens when Americans think confidence will finally break the spell. I saw it at a pub during a football match when an American guy said, "Okay, explain this to me. Why do you call it football when you barely use your feet?" The Brit beside him didn't look away from the screen. "Tradition," he said. The American scoffed. "That's not an answer." The Brit nodded. "It usually is." The American leaned closer. "No, seriously, it makes no sense." The Brit turned, smiled kindly, and said, "You're absolutely right. We've all just been waiting for you to point it out." The American grinned, thinking he'd cracked him. "So you admit it's dumb?" "Oh no," the Brit said. "We admit you're upset." The aftermath was brutal. The American kept explaining. The Brit stopped responding. Everyone else listened to the American argue with silence, which somehow felt louder than yelling. My reflection hit fast. Once a Brit disengages politely, the argument is already over and you're just talking to the room. Another time it escalated at a dinner table when politics came up, which Americans treat like a competitive sport. The American said, "Well, statistically, the US does way more for global security than you guys." The Brit across from him raised his eyebrows. "How reassuring," he said. "We were worried." The American laughed. "I mean, it's just facts." "Of course," the Brit replied. "Facts are very comforting when delivered loudly." The American leaned forward, stacking data like sandbags. "You can look it up." The Brit nodded slowly. "I believe you've looked it up." "So you agree?" the American asked. "I agree that you're committed," the Brit said. The aftermath was immediate. The table shifted. Someone changed the subject. The American felt robbed. Later he said, he wouldn't engage. I told him, he did. You just didn't notice the exit. The absurdity really spikes in workplaces. I watched an American manager say, "I'm just trying to streamline things. There's no need for all these steps." A British employee smiled. "We do like a scenic route." The American chuckled. "I'm serious." "So is the route," the Brit said. The American frowned. You're resisting change. Not at all, the Brit replied. We're watching it approach. The aftermath came in emails. Polite, calm emails that documented everything. The American thought he'd won the meeting. He didn't realize he'd lost the paper trail. My reflection was simple. Americans fight in the moment. Brits prepare receipts. The wildest escalation I saw was online, where Americans assume sarcasm has a font. An American commented, "This is why nothing gets fixed here." A Brit replied, "Yes, your concern has been noted by the nation." The American shot back, "I'm trying to help." "Heroic," the Brit wrote. The American doubled down with paragraphs. The Brit responded with one line, "Thank you for your service." The aftermath was merciless. Likes piled up on the Brit's replies. The American asked, "Why is everyone against me?" They weren't against him. They understood the joke. My reflection settled in hard. Escalation isn't volume versus volume. It's effort versus effortlessness. And effortlessness always wins. By this point, the Americans weren't just confused. They were destabilized. They kept saying things like, "Just say what you mean." And Brits kept replying, "We are." That's the moment it tips from funny to fatal, because once Americans realize they're losing, they try to fight sarcasm with sincerity. And that never ends well, because what comes next isn't louder arguments. It's quieter ones, with sharper edges, and fewer witnesses willing to warn you before it's too late. The reason this keeps happening isn't random. It's baked into education, upbringing, and social norms. Americans are trained to argue from day one. Debate club in high school, persuasive essays, standardized tests, they all reward clarity, directness, and volume. You're supposed to state your position, back it up with facts, and defend it relentlessly. Politeness is optional, nuance is secondary, and the louder you are, the more attention you command. It works at home, in school, in corporate boardrooms. It does not work in Britain. Brits, on the other hand, are trained in understatement. From a young age, humor, subtlety, and indirectness are prized. Sarcasm is social currency. A well-timed "how kind of you" can convey admiration, mockery, and dismissal all at once. In this system, the person who speaks loudly is almost always the person losing. The quieter you are, the more control you hold. Americans often misinterpret this as passivity. It's not. It's precision. Psychologically, Americans also have a bias toward explicit communication. If it isn't spelled out, it might as well not exist. They expect statements to match intentions word for word. British sarcasm operates on the opposite principle. Meaning often hides behind tone, context, and shared social understanding. An American will hear, "Well, that was clever," and assume praise. A Brit will hear it and assume you've already failed the test of social awareness. The mismatch is like two radios tuned to different frequencies. The louder one gets, the fuzzier the reception. Then there's the social aspect. Americans treat arguments as competitions with winners and losers. Brits often treat arguments as performances, or more accurately, as observations. You're allowed to attempt, but the audience is assessing your awareness, timing, and humility. Misreading the cues doesn't just cost face. It becomes a small, quietly humiliating spectacle. An American who argues with polite sarcasm is like a cat trying to negotiate with a door. It can push, it can paw, it can hiss, but the door remains unmoved and completely indifferent. So when Americans double down with logic, charts, or earnest repetition, Brits respond with calm observation. It's not arrogance, it's pattern recognition. Years of social training allow them to detect overconfidence, eagerness, and desperation within seconds. By the time the American realizes they're losing, the Brit has already finished the conversation in their mind. And this is why, no matter how prepared, Americans consistently lose against sarcastic subtlety. It's a weapon forged in cultural literacy, not volume, and you can't fight what you can't hear. The peak moments are where Americans stop just being confused and start feeling personally defeated. I remember one evening in a tiny flat in Edinburgh. An American guy tried to explain why tipping a taxi driver exactly 20% made sense. "It's standard back home. Fair, Consistent, predictable, he said. The Brit listening sipped his tea, then smiled gently. Oh yes, we love standards, he said. Nothing like a good rule to ruin spontaneity. The American leaned forward. So you don't tip properly here? We tip according to feeling, the Brit said. Mostly regret. The aftermath was subtle but effective. The American left the flat muttering about inefficiency, unaware he'd been taught a lesson in social nuance without anyone raising their voice. My reflection? Peak moments aren't loud. They're elegantly cruel. Another unforgettable peak moment happened at a dinner party in London. An American argued that everyone should vote the same way he did on a trivia game. It's obviously the correct answer, he said, nudging the nearest Brit. The Brit smiled faintly, tilting his glass. Oh, absolutely. We were just waiting for you to explain why ignorance is thrilling. The American laughed, thinking he'd charmed him. Glad you agree. Oh, we agree entirely, the Brit said. We agree that you're committed to being wrong. The room erupted in quiet chuckles. The American froze, looking around. The aftermath? He never spoke for the rest of the evening. My reflection. Sarcasm is like a scalpel. You don't need to raise your voice to leave a permanent mark. Then there was the classic pub confrontation. An American guy loudly corrected a Brit on the pronunciation of aluminium. No, it's aluminum, he insisted. The Brit smiled faintly. Yes, that would be the American way. Charming. The American leaned closer. It's not charming, it's correct. Oh, absolutely correct, said the Brit. Correctly wrong, you mean. Laughter rippled across the pub. The aftermath was merciless. The American spent the next 20 minutes trying to justify himself to strangers who had already taken bets on how long it would take him to break. My reflection? Peak moments are public, polished, and personal all at once. They sting because the American thought they were in control. Finally, I watched one unfold in a lecture hall. An American student tried to argue a point of history with a British professor. Well, back home we learn it this way, the student said. Interesting, the professor replied. I've always preferred the version that doesn't inflate national ego. The American laughed nervously. No, really, you're wrong. Ah, said the professor, smiling like a cat watching a mouse. I see. You've discovered sarcasm late in life. The aftermath? The student left red-faced but convinced he'd made a mark. My reflection? Peak moments hit hardest when the American finally detects the sarcasm. But it's too late. By then, they've been outmaneuvered politely, publicly, and perfectly. These stories show the psychological turning point. Mild cases confuse. Escalating absurdities frustrate. Peak moments devastate. And they all share the same secret. Americans fight loudly, with logic. Brits observe quietly, with precision. By the end of it, the lesson is clear. In Britain, arguing isn't about volume or facts. It's about knowing when you're already beaten, and Americans rarely do until it's painfully obvious. The next step is reflection, the part where you realize there's a pattern to this polite destruction. And that's where the real insight begins. By the time you've seen a few of these peak moments, a pattern emerges so clear it's almost beautiful. Americans enter arguments expecting clarity to carry them through. Facts, volume, repetition, these are their weapons. Brits enter arguments expecting subtlety to do the same. Timing, tone, and a perfectly placed phrase are theirs. The difference isn't intelligence, it's literacy and social nuance. It's remarkable, really. Americans will leave a conversation thinking they've been polite, helpful, or logical, when in reality they've been carefully dismantled. I've seen people apologize for being too direct, while the Brit they addressed is nodding, sipping tea, fully aware they've won without raising a hand. That's the brilliance of sarcasm. It lets the audience watch someone collapse under their own assumptions. And Americans keep missing the cues because they're looking for argument markers that don't exist. The key takeaway is empathy. Understanding this isn't about mocking Americans. It's about recognizing cultural misalignment. The Americans aren't failing because they're dumb. They're failing because their toolkit doesn't match the environment. The Brits aren't cruel. They're polite, patient, and precise. And sarcasm is simply a method of communication that Americans haven't mastered. The soft moral is simple. Sometimes the smartest move isn't arguing. It's pausing, listening, and realizing that volume doesn't equal victory. Americans assume directness wins. Brits assume patience and subtlety win. The collision produces comedy, embarrassment, and occasionally, awe. By recognizing the pattern, you can navigate it, laugh at it, and maybe even survive it intact. And if there's one thing I've learned as an observer, it's this. The real lesson isn't how to argue with British sarcasm. The real lesson is how quickly Americans surrender to it without realizing they've already lost. That understanding, that quiet, clever collapse, is what makes watching these moments endlessly fascinating. It's a cultural phenomenon, a psychological study, and a comedy show all rolled into one. The stage is set, and the Americans keep performing, blissfully unaware that the finale has already happened. So here we are, back where we started, with Americans confidently leaning in, convinced they're about to win a conversation, and Brits calmly dismantling them without breaking a sweat. The pattern is obvious now. Enter with logic, leave humbled, and maybe, just maybe, learn something along the way. If you've laughed at these stories, imagine living them. Americans, you might want to pause before explaining the rules of tipping, football, or trivial debates next time. Brits, you can keep your subtle smirks and gentle phrases. They work every time. And for the rest of us? We get front row seats to a kind of polite, perfectly executed chaos that is endlessly entertaining. I want to hear from you. Have you been on either side of this? Did an American friend misread sarcasm and make a fool of themselves? Or were you the one quietly watching someone unravel without them noticing? Comment below and share your story. The more absurd, the better. And of course, if you want more cross-cultural chaos, stories of Americans versus Brits, Canadians, Australians, and beyond, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment when logic meets understatement and loses spectacularly. Because here's the final zinger. In Britain, if someone is arguing loudly, you might survive. If they're polite, run.